How does a company of 108 men hold off a battle-hardened regiment of 2,500 soldiers for 3.5 hours in a monsoon? Most of them barely 20 years old, many of them conscripts who never chose to be there. How do they do it with no air support? Their ammunition nearly gone, their platoon commanders dead or cut off, and the enemy closing to within 20 meters of their position. How does a story this extraordinary stay buried for more than 50 years while the men who lived it were denied the recognition they earned in blood? Before we answer any of that, tell me in the comments, did you know Australia fought in Vietnam? Because what you are about to discover has been suppressed, distorted, and filed away by the very government that sent these men to war. The story of Long Tan is not simply about how 108 men survived the unsurvivable. It is about what their own country did to them afterward. And that second story is almost more shocking than the first. Forget the sanitized official history. Today we are opening the file. Are you ready? Then let's go. To understand what happened in a rubber plantation in Phuoc Tuy Province on the afternoon of August the 18th, 1966, you must first understand the trap that had been built around the Australians long before a single shot was fired. The trap was not constructed in a single afternoon by clever men with maps. It had been built over months, and its foundations were not military, but political, the consequence of decisions made in distant capitals by men who did not have to live with the consequences. Australia had committed forces to Vietnam under the ANZUS alliance, the logic of Cold War containment, and the belief that if South Vietnam fell, the entire region would follow. More than 60,000 Australians would serve in the country between 1962 and 1973. The war was divisive at home from the very start. Conscription was in place, meaning that significant numbers of soldiers in the field had not volunteered to be there. They had been sent. Young men in their late teens and early 20s were being drafted into an army that would ship them to a country most of them had never thought about, to fight an enemy most of them could not have identified on a map 6 months earlier. The government was managing public anxiety about the conflict at every level, carefully controlling what the population knew and when they knew it, a fact that would have consequences reaching far beyond the battlefield and long beyond the war itself. In the spring of 1966, the first elements of the 1st Australian Task Force began arriving in Phuoc Tuy Province. By June, they were establishing their base at Nui Dat, a position that sat directly in the heart of territory the Viet Cong had controlled for years. The choice of Nui Dat was strategically deliberate. The Australians wanted their own area of operations separate from the Americans, where they could apply their own methods and demonstrate what Australian soldiers could do in this kind of war. The problem was that the land they had chosen was not empty, it was not neutral. It was the operational heartland of 2 Viet Cong formations that had been fighting in that province since before the Americans arrived, and who regarded the new Australian base as a direct provocation in their own backyard. To secure the base, the Australians made a decision that was militarily logical and politically catastrophic in equal measure. They forcibly relocated the civilian populations of 2 nearby villages, Long Tan and Long Phuoc. Families who had lived in those places for generations were moved out. Ancestral homes were abandoned. Fields that had been tended for decades were left behind. The Viet Cong had regarded this area as what they called a liberated zone, a region they had held, administered, and recruited from throughout the long years of the French colonial period and beyond. The local D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion had been born in that soil. Its soldiers had grown up in those villages. They knew every drainage ditch, every rubber tree row, every path through the plantation. They had watched the evacuation of their communities with a fury that the Australian commanders, sitting in their headquarters, did not fully comprehend. And they intended to demonstrate to the remaining population of Phuoc Tuy that the Australians had not won anything, that their base was an illusion of security surrounded by a province that still belonged to the revolution. Watching from the hills above Nui Dat was the Viet Cong 275th Main Force Regiment, commanded by Senior Captain Nguyen Thoi Bung, known to his men by his battlefield name, Ut Thoi. This was not a collection of ragged guerrillas in black pajamas, main force soldiers, professionals. The 275th was a seasoned regiment, 1,400 men in 3 battalions, armed with AK-47 Kalashnikov rifles, RPG, 2 rocket-propelled grenades, light and heavy machine guns, 82mm mortars and recoilless rifles. They had previously destroyed a South Vietnamese Ranger battalion in an ambush near Nui Thi Vai. They had fought the American 173rd Airborne Brigade in Operation Hardihood just 3 months earlier, inflicting 23 American killed and 160 wounded. These were professional soldiers who had been at war for years before the Australians arrived. They understood the terrain, the weather, the rhythms of the province, and the psychology of their enemy at a level the newcomers could not yet match. The plan the Viet Cong commanders developed in early August of 1966 was elegant in its brutality. It was also, in a profound and ironic sense, the plan that would produce their own destruction. The 275th Regiment would move toward Nui Dat and fire mortars into the base. The bombardment would anger the Australians and force a response. A patrol sent out to find the mortar positions and locate the direction of the enemy withdrawal. That patrol force would then walk into a 3-kilometer-wide semicircle of waiting soldiers, positioned since early morning, and be overwhelmed by sheer numbers before they could call for help or organize a defense. With the patrol eliminated and the Australians' mobile reserve committed to the field chasing survivors, the lightly defended Nui Dat base itself could be seized. The Viet Cong had estimated Australian garrison strength at 3,000 men. They planned to mortar the base to draw a response force into an ambush, with 2 battalions of the 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion forming the killing ground, while the remaining battalion stood ready to take the base once the fighting in the field was over. Former Viet Cong Major Sao Thu of D445 Battalion would confirm the plan decades later, in words that carried the full weight of all that followed. They had been ordered to lure the Australians out of Nui Dat, kill as many as possible, capture their weapons, and take the base. On the night of August the 16th into the 17th, the first phase of the plan was executed. Viet Cong mortar teams and recoilless rifle crews opened fire on Nui Dat for 22 minutes. More than 100 rounds came in. 22 Australians were wounded. One gunner, Philip Norris, would later die of his wounds in Australia. The men in the base grabbed their weapons and stood to in their weapon pits, adrenaline burning through them, waiting for the ground assault that the mortar barrage was supposed to precede. No assault came. The guns fell silent. The darkness returned. Dawn arrived gray and humid. And in the morning light, the bombardment looked like it might have been nothing more than a harassing attack. Unpleasant, costly, but not the opening phase of something much larger. The intelligence assessment at headquarters continued to judge a major ground attack as unlikely. The threat appeared to have passed. The next morning, B Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was sent out to find the mortar positions and track the enemy withdrawal. They found the abandoned pits. They found the firing lines scraped into the earth. They found bloodstains from Australian counter-battery fire and evidence that the area had been occupied by a significant force. What they did not find was the enemy itself. The Viet Cong had vanished back into the plantation with the discipline of soldiers who had been doing this for years. They left footprints and cold ashes and nothing else. B Company reported back. The search continued the following day, with D Company taking over the patrol. And so, on the morning of August the 18th, 1966, 108 men marched out of Nui Dat into the Long Tan rubber plantation. They were Delta Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. They were, on paper, a rifle company being sent on a standard search and destroy patrol to locate the mortar firing positions and determine the direction of the enemy withdrawal. They were, in reality, about to walk into the rear of an ambush formation, 2,500 men strong, that had been lying in position since before dawn. And the man leading them was not a man who would accept dying quietly. Major Harry Arthur Smith was 33 years old on the 18th of August, 1966. Born in Hobart, Tasmania, in July of 1933. His father had served as a sergeant in the General Grant tanks of the 2nd Australian Armoured Division in World War II, and the military ran in the family the way some families pass down trades. Harry Smith had joined the regular army as a private soldier, worked his way through the ranks, and graduated from the Officer Cadet School at Port C in December of 1952. He had served during the Malayan Emergency with the 2nd Battalion between 1955 and 1957. Real jungle warfare against a real insurgency, not training exercises in safe country. He had trained with 2 Commando Company in Melbourne before being posted to 6 RAR at Inagara, outside Brisbane, in 1965, where he was promoted to acting major and given command of Delta Company. The Army considered him talented and difficult in roughly equal measure. He argued with senior officers when he believed they were wrong. He refused to be what soldiers called a yes man. He made decisions quickly and backed them completely, and some of his superiors found this quality more troubling than reassuring. He had a strained relationship with his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend. That was common knowledge within the battalion. Some men in the company believed this friction meant Delta regularly drew the least desirable assignments, the extra patrols, the worst ground, the jobs nobody else wanted. Whether that was true or not, on the morning of August the 18th, Delta Company drew the patrol that would define Australian military history. What Smith had done with Delta Company at Inagara was methodical and unrelenting. He trained them to Special Forces fitness standards, demanding levels of physical conditioning that went well beyond standard infantry requirements. He demanded discipline, teamwork, and what he always called mateship, not as a sentiment, but as a military quality, the bond of absolute trust under fire that holds a unit together when everything else is falling apart. He believed that mateship, properly built through training, was the difference between a company that fought and a company that died. His men would prove him right. Their theme song during the long training marches became Nancy Sinatra's hit from that year, "These Boots Were Made for Walking." They would log countless kilometers in those boots before they were done. By the time Delta Company arrived in Vietnam in June of 1966, They were, in Smith's own assessment, a cohesive team, ready to face whatever the province could produce. Smith's platoon commanders were 3 young officers who would bear the full weight of what was coming. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp commanded 11 Platoon, the forward right element. Sharp was 21 years old, a national serviceman from Tamworth in New South Wales. Before the Army had claimed him through conscription, he had worked as a television cameraman, a young man with a creative career ahead of him, an active social life, the kind of ordinary future that the draft had interrupted. He had been through the accelerated officer training course at Shyville and emerged as a second lieutenant responsible for 28 young men, most of them his own age or younger, most of them also national servicemen who had not chosen to be where they were. He was popular, capable, and completely unaware that he would not survive the afternoon. Second Lieutenant Dave Sabin led 12 platoon. Second Lieutenant Jeff Kendall led 10 platoon. Behind all 3 platoons, the company's operational backbone was Warrant Officer Class 2, Jack Kirby, the company sergeant major. Kirby was 31 years old, a Malayan emergency veteran, built like the job itself, big in frame and steadiness both. During the long training runs at Enoggera, he had been unable to keep pace with the younger men, but he always finished. He always came in behind the rest, sweating and determined, plugging along with the grinding persistence of a man who understood that finishing matters more than leading, and in doing so, he had earned something no amount of physical performance could manufacture: the absolute trust of every soldier in the company. They would follow Jack Kirby anywhere. On August the 18th, they would have to. There was one more man in Delta Company who would prove more decisive than any other that afternoon, and he was not Australian. Captain Maury Stanley, Maury to everyone who knew him, was a New Zealander from the 161st Battery of the Royal New Zealand Artillery, attached to Delta Company as forward artillery observer. Born in Christchurch in 1931, son of a drill master, he had won his place at Duntroon Military Academy on merit and spent his career mastering the precise and unforgiving mathematics of artillery fire control. His job on any patrol was to serve as the living connection between the infantry on the ground and the guns at Nui Dat. He carried the radio, worked the coordinates, and translated the chaos of contact into the precise language the gunners needed to put steel on target. In practice, on August the 18th, his job would become something far more extreme, more frightening, and more consequential than anything that description suggests. Beside him on the patrol were 2 other New Zealanders from 161 Battery, Bombardier Willie Walker and Bombardier Murray Broomhall. 3 men, 1 function: keep the guns informed, keep the fire accurate, and above all else, do not make a mistake. The cost of a mistake, when the shells were landing 30 meters from your own position, was something none of them allowed themselves to think about directly. On the morning of August the 18th, Delta Company had been expecting a concert. The entertainment troupe featuring Australian performer Little Paddy and Cole Joe had arrived at Nui Dat that morning, flown in from the coast by the base's 2 No. 9 Squadron RAAF Iroquois helicopters. The men who were staying at the base had something to look forward to, a rare treat in a life defined by patrols and waiting, and the grinding tedium of a war that was never where you expected it to be. Delta Company had the patrol. As they marched out of the wire at 11:15 that morning, the sounds of the concert beginning drifted behind them on the still, heavy air. Popular music, ordinary and alive, fading as the rows of rubber trees closed around them, and the base disappeared behind their backs. Some of the men turned and listened for a moment before the plantation swallowed the sound entirely. The same 2 helicopters that had just flown the concert party in would, in approximately 7 hours, make the most important flight of the entire battle. Neither the pilots nor the soldiers knew that yet. They moved through the rubber plantation in standard formation, 10 and 11 platoons forward and spread wide, with 12 platoon and company headquarters following behind. The terrain was flat, and the plantation was disciplined, rubber trees standing in long parallel rows that created corridors of visibility stretching away into the heat haze. The men found the abandoned mortar positions B Company had located the day before. They found weapon pits, firing lines, evidence of a significant force recently departed. Then they spread out further and moved east, following tracks, looking for the direction the enemy had gone. The sky had been overcast all afternoon, the air thick and heavy, the kind of weather that sits on a man like a wet blanket and says something is coming. They had been walking for nearly 4 hours when the first contact came. At approximately 3:40 in the afternoon, a small group of Viet Cong soldiers walked directly into the middle of 11 platoons extended formation. The collision was mutual surprise, 2 forces blundering into each other in the corridor between the rubber trees. Sergeant Bob Buick, Sharp's platoon sergeant, reacted instantly and fired, wounding one of the enemy soldiers. The others grabbed their wounded man and ran eastward into the plantation, disappearing between the trees. Sharp radioed back to Smith. The contact had lasted seconds. What Sharp noticed in those seconds, what every man nearby noticed immediately, was that these soldiers were wearing full camouflage uniforms and carrying AK-47 Kalashnikov rifles, not the black pajamas and aging French weapons of local irregular fighters. These were main force soldiers, professionals who had been issued modern Soviet weapons and trained to use them. Sharp reported this to Smith. 11 platoon gave chase eastward into the trees. The critical fact about the geometry of that pursuit is one that would only become fully understood in the hours and days and years after the battle. The Viet Cong had positioned their 3-kilometer semicircle of 2,500 men from 10:15 that morning, waiting for the Australians to enter from the west and walk into the center of the killing ground. Delta Company's patrol route had taken them 1,500 meters further east than the Viet Cong plan had anticipated. They had entered the formation from entirely the wrong direction, from the rear, coming in behind the ambush, colliding with soldiers who had been expecting Australians to appear somewhere else entirely. Former Viet Cong Major Phuoc Tuy would put it plainly in an interview 40 years after the battle. They thought the Australians would go one way. The Australians went the wrong way and came behind them. The plan that was supposed to destroy Delta Company had been geometrically disrupted before a single sustained shot was fired. What followed was not a classical ambush. It was a regiment of 2,500 turning around to deal with 108 who had arrived through the back door. At 4:08 in the afternoon, the monsoon arrived. The sky did not darken gradually. It simply fell. A tropical downpour of extraordinary violence dropped visibility in the plantation to 50 meters in seconds, turned the red laterite ground to ankle-deep mud that sucked at boots with every step, and grounded every available aircraft within operational range. 3 USF-4 Phantom jets had been on standby. They were now useless. In the same moment the rain hit, 11 Platoon, still advancing an extended line eastward in pursuit of the fleeing contact group, walked into the forward elements of the 275th Regiment as those battalions were moving to engage them. The collision was instant, total, and catastrophic in its immediacy. 4 Australians died in the first seconds. The survivors dropped into the mud and began firing into the gray curtain of rain, aiming at muzzle flashes, at shapes between the rubber trees, at the sound of movement in the downpour. Sharp immediately called for artillery support. 5 kilometres to the west, at the gun line in Nui Dat, the New Zealand crews of 161 Battery began the calculations. The first salvos missed. At 4:26 in the afternoon, the initial rounds landed short of the target. Corrections were called in and adjustments made. Kendall's 10 Platoon, positioned on the forward left, was ordered to move right and assist 11 Platoon. Before Kendall could reach Sharp, his own platoon came under equally intense fire from enemy soldiers using the rubber tree rows as cover and was pinned to the ground before it had covered half the distance. Both forward platoons' radios then failed almost simultaneously, one destroyed by enemy fire and one with its antenna shot away. The company commander at company headquarters suddenly lost contact with both his forward elements. In the space of 20 minutes, more than half of 11 platoons, 28 men, were dead or wounded on the plantation floor. The platoon was isolated from the rest of the company, cut off from all support, almost out of the ammunition they had carried out of the wire that morning. And the enemy was continuing to work around their flanks to complete the encirclement. Gordon Sharp was killed at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. He rose to his knees in the mud to better direct the incoming artillery fire, to lift his head above the ground and see the actual positions, to call corrections into the radio that had just been repaired by a runner dispatched from company headquarters. A single bullet passed through his neck. He fell where he had knelt. He was 21 years old. A television cameraman from Tamworth, who had been conscripted into an army and sent to a war and put in command of 28 young men in a rubber plantation in South Vietnam. A photograph taken on the morning after the battle would show him exactly as the night had left him, lying on the plantation floor with his M16 still in his hands, facing the direction of the enemy. He would receive no award for what he did in those last minutes of his life, not for 50 years. Sergeant Bob Buick took command of what remained of 11 Platoon. The situation he inherited in those minutes was this: his platoon had been cut off from the company for over 30 minutes. More than half his men were dead or wounded. His radio antenna had been shot away. The enemy was pressing on 3 sides, and the ammunition was nearly gone. He sent a desperate radio message on the repaired set requesting more ammunition and requesting assistance. Company headquarters had already dispatched Private William Arkell through the open ground of the firefight, carrying a replacement radio, an act of extraordinary individual courage for which Arkell would later receive a mention in dispatches. He killed 3 enemy soldiers on the way. With communication restored, Buick reported his full situation to Smith. Then he made the decision that would define the entire battle. He directed Captain Maury Stanley to bring the artillery fire directly over the top of his own position. The mathematics of what Buick was asking need to be understood clearly to appreciate what it meant. A 105mm howitzer shell exploding in soft ground produces lethal fragments at a radius of 150 meters from the point of detonation. Buick was asking for those shells to land 50 meters from his own men. He was not requesting defensive fire on the approaches to his position. He was requesting fire that would, by any standard artillery safety calculation, land inside the lethal radius of his own defensive perimeter. He made this request because the alternative was certain death. The enemy was 20 to 50 meters away and closing. The calculated risk of being hit by his own artillery was preferable to the absolute certainty of being overrun by a force that outnumbered what remained of his platoon by a factor he had stopped counting. Some of his men had already run completely out of ammunition and were lying in the mud with empty rifles. The sound that reached Harry Smith through Buick's radio in those minutes was the sound of his men cheering each time an artillery round exploded among the enemy, not from any feeling of triumph, but simply because they had nothing left to shoot, and the shells were the only weapons they had. 5 kilometers to the west, at company headquarters inside the Nui Dot base, Captain Maurice Stanley stood beside Harry Smith and worked the problem with everything he had. His map was already deteriorating, the paper softening in the continuous downpour, the grid lines beginning to blur where the water ran across the printed coordinates. His radio contact reached 24 guns simultaneously. The howitzers of 161 Battery and the Australian 103 and 105 batteries, firing their 105mm rounds, plus 6 American 155mm self-propelled howitzers from the 2nd Battalion, 35th Artillery Regiment. He would later speak about that afternoon with a precision that revealed how completely he had understood the stakes. I had to overcome my dread that I would make a mistake. He called the corrections. He adjusted the coordinates as the battle moved and shifted. He brought the fire in closer with every adjustment. He did not make a mistake. The guns at Nui Dat were firing at 6 to 8 rounds per minute, 2 above the intense rate of fire, nearly without pause for hours. 161 batteries clerks and administrative staff and vehicle drivers had been pulled from their normal duties and placed on the gun line to keep the ammunition flowing, every available body doing whatever was needed to maintain the rate. Every man who could lift a shell was lifting shells. The barrels were heating steadily. The rate of fire was not sustainable indefinitely, but it was sustaining for now, minute by minute, the lives of 108 men 4 kilometers to the east who were holding a perimeter that should not have been holdable. While Buick held what remained of 11 platoon in place with artillery fire that would have killed them on the wrong calculation, the company was fracturing further in the plantation. Smith sent Sabin's 12 platoon, reduced to only 20 men because one section had been left behind to protect the wounded accumulating at company headquarters, westward around the plantation to approach 11 platoon's position from a different direction than Kendall had attempted. 12 platoon ran immediately into groups of enemy soldiers moving to complete the encirclement of 11 platoon from the west, attempting to close the last gap through which any rescue might come. In the fighting that followed, 8 of Sabin's 20 men were wounded. The platoon kept moving, taking casualties, leaving blood in the mud, but keeping the corridor open through sheer refusal to stop and accept what the numbers were telling them. Kendall's 10 platoon, ordered simultaneously to withdraw from its exposed forward position back to company headquarters, did so under sustained fire, losing more men on the way back across ground that had been safe when they crossed it 20 minutes earlier. 3 United States F-4 Phantom jets arrived overhead at 5:09 in the afternoon, responding to the earlier request for close air support. Delta Company threw colored smoke grenades to mark their position for the pilots, the standard identification procedure that worked in clear conditions. The monsoon rain kept the smoke pinned to the ground beneath the canopy. It rose perhaps a meter above the plantation floor before the rain pushed it back down. The pilots, looking through hundreds of meters of solid rain cloud from altitude, could see nothing that helped them. Smith faced an immediate and consequential decision. While the jets were in the overhead airspace, the artillery had to cease firing because the two systems could not safely operate simultaneously in the same column of air above the target area. Every minute the guns were silent was a minute in which the enemy was not taking casualties and the Australians were. Smith waved off the aircraft and directed them instead to drop their ordnance on the enemy's suspected rear area positions to the north and east. The jets banked away. The artillery resumed. It was the correct decision, and Smith made it in seconds, under fire, in a monsoon, after 90 minutes of continuous combat. By 5:15 in the afternoon, 11 platoon situation had gone beyond critical and arrived somewhere that had no useful tactical name. Buick reported to Smith with the controlled, functional calm of a man who has burned through fear and come out the other side into something harder and quieter. Almost surrounded, heavy casualties, almost no ammunition, unable to withdraw. Smith ordered Sabin to take his reduced 12 platoon to 11 platoon's location immediately. Sabin moved his 20 men through enemy soldiers who were trying to close the gap, sustained further casualties among the men he was trying to use as a rescue force, and threw a colored smoke grenade to signal his position to the battered 11 platoon. What remained of Sharp's platoon, Buick, and 8 men from an original 28 made a running break through the enemy contact, fighting through the interference, and reached 12 platoon. The combined group fought their way 300 meters back through the plantation to company headquarters. At 5:45 in the afternoon, Delta Company was consolidated at a single position for the first time in 90 minutes. They were outnumbered, surrounded, severely depleted, and very nearly out of ammunition. But they were together. And together, with artillery, 108 men could hold ground that otherwise would have swallowed them. The ammunition crisis was by this point no longer a concern for the future. It was the immediate operational reality determining whether anyone survived the next hour. The formal request for helicopter resupply had worked its way up the command chain and encountered resistance. Group Captain Peter Raw, the senior RAAF officer at Nui Dat, had refused to authorize the flight on the grounds that the landing zone was unsecured, the conditions were operationally impossible in a full monsoon with failing light and sustained ground fire, and the risk to the aircraft and their crews was unacceptable under standard procedures. The request was simultaneously passed to the American liaison officer at the base, who indicated his people could attempt the mission. Raw, confronted with the prospect of the Americans flying a resupply that the RAAF had declined, reversed his decision and authorized his own aircraft to go. The 2 RAAF Iroquois helicopters available at Nui Dat, flown by Flight Lieutenants Frank Riley and Bob Grandin, who had spent that same morning flying the concert party to the base, took off into the monsoon. They flew at treetop height through near zero visibility, navigating by instruments and nerve, arriving over the plantation at approximately 6 in the evening. They hovered at 30 feet above the canopy while their crews pushed blanket-wrapped ammunition crates out through the doors, dropping them through the rubber trees, directly onto the position below. The artillery ceased for 15 minutes to allow the helicopters to work without the risk of being brought down by their own guns. The crates landed in the mud among the Australians. It was enough, not comfortably enough, not with any margin for error, barely enough but enough to keep fighting. What was happening at Nui Dat while Delta Company bled in the plantation needs to be part of this record, because it is not simply a supporting detail. It is the second story running beneath the first. At 4:54 in the afternoon, while Buick's men were cheering artillery because they had exhausted their own ammunition, Brigadier Oliver Jackson, the commander of the 1st Australian Task Force, was asked to release A Company and the Armored Personnel Carrier Troop as a relief force. He refused. His reasoning was not without military logic, and the men who have judged him most harshly have not always acknowledged that. He did not know the true size of the force facing Delta Company. His intelligence picture was incomplete. Reports coming back through Smith were indicating what appeared to be at least a main force regiment, but the locations of the other battalions of that regiment were unknown. His own base at Nui Dat, stripped of its mobile reserve, would be vulnerable if the enemy had a second element positioned to exploit the gap. He had approximately 1,000 men at base and was being asked to send the core of his mobile capability into a fight whose full dimensions he could not see. He held his position. For over an hour after that request was made, 108 men fought without relief coming. For over an hour, the gap between the outcome that happened and the outcome that almost happened narrowed with every assault that reached the Australian position. Jackson would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his role in this battle. His citation would state that he had personally directed the engagement. Harry Smith would spend the next 3 decades explaining, with documented specificity and barely restrained fury, exactly why that claim was not true. The relief, when Jackson finally authorized it, and it came, arrived with the violence of men who had heard the radio traffic and understood what they were driving toward. Lieutenant Adrian Roberts at Nui Dat had mustered his armored personnel carrier troop without waiting for the final word and had started moving east at 5:45. His column of 10 M113 armored personnel carriers ground across flooded paddy and jungle track in the darkening afternoon, moving as fast as the waterlogged ground would allow. Approximately 1 kilometer from Delta Company's position, the column encountered the D445 Battalion Company that had been specifically placed to block any armored reinforcement and complete the encirclement from the south. This was the rear stop of the ambush, the element designed to prevent exactly what Roberts was now doing. Roberts did not look for a way around them. He attacked directly into the position, 50 caliber machine guns firing from the vehicles, dismounted infantry pushing into the fight with the purpose of men who had one objective and no time to negotiate it. The D445 position was broken. The southern jaw of the trap was dismantled in minutes and the column moved on. At 6:35, the largest assault wave of the entire battle began to form up in the trees surrounding the consolidated Delta Company position. Whistles sounded through the plantation. Bugles called, their notes carrying strangely through the rain. Lines of gray-clad soldiers began moving forward through the rubber trees in coordinated waves, screaming war cries, closing from 3 sides simultaneously on the Australian perimeter. The artillery fire tore through the front ranks of the assault as they crossed open ground, shells exploding among the advancing men, throwing bodies backward, breaking the cohesion of the attack lines before they could build momentum. Those who survived the artillery barrage and reached the Australian perimeter met rifle fire and machine gun fire at close range in the mud. The ground itself was working against the attackers. The soft, waterlogged red soil absorbed the artillery blast rather than multiplying it, reducing the lateral fragmentation effect that makes artillery so lethal on harder ground. The rain had risen as mist from the churned earth to chest height across the plantation floor. Dave Sabin, looking outward from his position in the perimeter, would describe the scene in words that have stayed with everyone who heard them. All that was visible above the mist were the diggers' hats and their eyes. Not even their rifles. 108 men in a gray world of mud and rain and rubber trees and the continuous deafening percussion of artillery, holding what discipline and refusal and the accuracy of guns 5 kilometers away made it possible to hold. Jack Kirby moved through all of it. The company sergeant major, 31 years old, the man who had always come in at the back of the training runs at Enoggera, moved through the entire company position during the worst of the wave attacks, as if the enemy fire was weather rather than threat. He distributed ammunition to men who had nearly exhausted what the helicopters had dropped. He carried wounded soldiers on his back to the aid post that Corporal Phil Dobson was running in a shallow hollow at the center of the position, Dobson treating 23 wounded men that afternoon without losing one. Kirby stopped beside men who were pinned down and frightened and said whatever needed to be said to keep them in the fight. He was always moving, always visible, always in the open when anyone who was thinking about survival would have been taking cover. At the most critical point of the final assault waves, as a mass of enemy soldiers pushed to within tens of meters of the perimeter, an enemy heavy machine gun team set up at a position 50 meters from the Australian lines. Once that weapon was properly emplaced and brought into action, it would be able to sweep the length of the Australian position, killing or wounding every man exposed above the mud. Kirby saw it being set up. He made no announcement. He left the perimeter alone and covered 50 meters of open ground under fire, reached the machine gun position, killed the crew before they could bring the weapon into action, and walked back to the perimeter. Then he continued distributing ammunition. Harry Smith told Lieutenant Colonel Townsend directly that Jack Kirby deserved the Victoria Cross. Townsend said he would sign a Distinguished Conduct Medal and nothing higher. Not a single Victoria Cross was awarded to any soldier across the entire 1st Australian Task Force for the entire Vietnam War, despite 500 men killed in action during Australia's involvement. At 6:55 in the evening, Robert's armored personnel carriers came through the eastern edge of the plantation, their 50 caliber machine guns firing into the assault waves that were in the process of trying to complete the encirclement, breaking the attack and driving the enemy back into the trees. The enemy, for the first time in the battle, began to disengage. At 7:10 in the evening, the fire ceased. Figures retreated between the rubber trees and disappeared. The plantation fell quiet. Delta Company, in their foxholes and in the mud, with their dead around them and their wounded in the aid post, and their weapons still in their hands, heard the guns stop and waited for the next wave. It did not come. In the sudden absence of noise, after hours of continuous detonation that had become the entire auditory world, the silence carried its own particular weight. Lieutenant Colonel Townsend arrived with the relief column and made the decision that no commander wants to make, but that the situation required. The dead of 11 platoon were still out there in the plantation, where they had fallen during the fight. The wounded who had not made it back were still out there. But a night operation in ground, the enemy still partially occupied, in darkness and mud, and without knowing what other forces might be in the area, carried risks that Townsend judged unacceptable. The carriers were loaded with Delta Company's wounded. The company pulled back 750 meters to the west and formed a defensive perimeter. By 10:45 that night, the last casualties had been evacuated by helicopter. The men were despondent in the way that exhausted soldiers are when they cannot see what they have accomplished. 17 of their number were dead in the plantation behind them. They would learn the next morning that the total was 18, including one from the armored carrier troop. 24 were wounded. They had fought for hours and then pulled back without holding the ground they had fought over. In the judgment of that dark, wet, exhausted night, Delta Company believed they had suffered a terrible defeat. Somewhere in the plantation behind them, in the darkness and the rain, 2 men were still alive. Privates Jim Richmond and Barry Mellor, both from 11 Platoon, both wounded during the fighting, had been unable to make it back with the others when the platoon broke for 12 Platoon's position. They lay where they had gone down, in the mud among the dead, surrounded by the bodies of their own platoon and the bodies of the enemy soldiers who had died within meters of them. Around them, moving quietly and purposefully through that same darkness, was a unit that no official Australian account would acknowledge fully for decades. The Phuoc Tuy Company, 80 personnel, mostly composed of women and young people, commanded by a woman named Chin Phuong, was the Viet Cong medical evacuation unit attached to the 275th Regiment. Through the night of August the 18th into the 19th, they moved systematically through the plantation, locating their own casualties, treating the wounded where they could, and carrying those who could be moved back toward the enemy rear areas. They worked in the same darkness in which Richmond and Mellor lay. They passed within meters of them. They did not harm them. When the Australians returned in the morning, Richmond and Mellor were found alive. Both sides wounded had shared the same mud that night, and the women who moved through the darkness had made a choice that said something about the nature of people that no official history adequately records. Elsewhere, while this was happening, Radio Hanoi and Radio Peking were broadcasting their account of August the 18th to the world. More than 500 Australian satellite troops had been wiped out, including 2 complete companies. 2 squadrons of tanks had been destroyed. The Australians had been comprehensively defeated and their base at Nui Dat badly damaged. The Australians had no tanks in Vietnam, not a single one. The enemy was telling its own population, and anyone else who was listening, about a battle that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened among the rubber trees. It was not the last time someone in authority would misrepresent what occurred at Long Tan. It would not even be the most consequential misrepresentation. On the morning of August the 19th, Delta Company returned to the plantation for battlefield clearance. Harry Smith, walking back into the area where his men had fought and died, described what he found in words that remain the most vivid account of that morning. All the branches and leaves torn from the trees as though the area had been hit by a Category 10 cyclone. 3,500 artillery shells had detonated across the plantation. The ground was torn and cratered. The red soil churned into deep mud. White latex oozed from bullet holes in the surviving rubber trees, and the mud itself was colored by blood. The dead of 11 Platoon were found exactly as the night had left them, lying on the ground facing outward, rifles pointed toward the enemy positions, still in the formation they had held. Gordon Sharp was found where he had fallen. Around them, extending through the shattered plantation in every direction, were 245 enemy dead. Every one of those bodies had to be searched individually. This was not something that could be abbreviated or delegated or avoided. Intelligence doctrine required it, and the men of Delta Company, who had been fighting for their lives in this same ground the previous afternoon, now moved through it conducting the systematic and deeply strange work of battlefield intelligence gathering. Every pack was opened and its contents catalogued. Every pocket was searched, every document recovered. Weapons were counted and recorded, and inside the wallets found on the dead, wrapped carefully in plastic against the humidity that destroyed everything left unprotected in the Vietnamese climate, were photographs. Families photographed in the ordinary poses that families use. Parents and children standing together. The kind of images that mean nothing until the person carrying them is dead in a foreign plantation, and you are the soldier holding the photograph. There were letters, folded many times and softened by the repeated folding of months. There were dried flowers pressed between the pages of notebooks, carried from home because someone could not bear to leave behind the thing they loved. The men of Delta Company, who had spent the previous afternoon killing these people, now held the evidence that those people had had everything worth living for, the same as any of them. The full accounting, when it was complete, 245 enemy bodies confirmed and searched. Estimated 500 total enemy killed when the soldiers carried away during the night by their own medical teams were included, a standard Viet Cong practice designed to deny intelligence and maintain unit morale. Estimated 750 wounded. Records captured in 1969 would list 800 killed or died of wounds from the Long Tan engagement. Artillery fire, directed by a New Zealand captain working from a dissolving map in a monsoon, had accounted for an estimated 90% of all those casualties. The 3 batteries at Nui Dat had fired more than 4,000 rounds across the entire engagement. The 275th Viet Cong Regiment, which had arrived at the Long Tan plantation as a fully functional main force formation capable of seizing an Australian base, would not be capable of major offensive operations in Phuoc Tuy Province for months. The plan to destroy Delta Company and take Nui Dat had failed completely. The Australians had suffered 18 killed and 24 wounded. 108 men had defeated 2,500. The Battle of Long Tan did not end when the enemy withdrew into the trees. It continued in the offices and corridors of power far from that plantation, in the deliberate quiet of administrative decisions made without public scrutiny and without accountability, for 57 more years. Major Harry Smith was given less than 24 hours after the battle ended to write all of his citation recommendations for his men. This single fact, held clearly in mind, makes everything that follows comprehensible. Less than 24 hours after a battle in which 17 of his men had been killed and 21 wounded, while those same men were still in shock, still being treated for their wounds, still trying to organize their minds around what they had survived, Smith sat at a desk and wrote every recommendation, every citation, working from memory, from field notes, from the accounts of men who were exhausted and grieving and not yet capable of the kind of measured recollection that citations require. Among the recommendations he submitted was a distinguished service order for himself, the award second only to the Victoria Cross for an officer of his rank, reserved by convention for cases of extraordinary command in combat. His platoon commanders Sabin and Kendall were recommended for the Military Cross. Company Sergeant Major Kirby was verbally recommended by Smith to Townsend for the Victoria Cross, a recommendation that Townsend declined to formalize. Kirby was put in for a Distinguished Conduct Medal, and various other men throughout Delta Company were cited for specific acts of gallantry that Smith had observed or been told about in the immediate aftermath. The recommendations entered the chain of command, and were reshaped by hands that had not been in the plantation. Civilian officials in the Department of Defense downgraded Smith's Distinguished Service Order to a military cross. The military cross recommendations for Sabin and Kendall were reduced to mentioned in dispatches, the lowest formal recognition available. Some citations simply disappeared from the administrative record entirely. Not delayed, not referred for further review, gone. During the entire Vietnam War, 726 awards were made to Australian personnel. 61 of those went to private soldiers. A paper published by the Military Historical Society of Australia in 1984 concluded that the majority of awards across the Vietnam War had gone to those furthest from the actual fighting. The system was not broken. It was working precisely as the hierarchy intended it to work. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp received no award. The 21-year-old conscript who had risen to his knees under fire to direct artillery, who had died performing that act, whose photograph lying dead on the plantation floor would become one of the defining images of Australia's Vietnam War, was given nothing. The same administrative process that denied Sharp even a mention in dispatches awarded that same recognition to a postal officer stationed at Vung Tau, the coastal rest and recreation facility well behind any front line. Brigadier Oliver Jackson, who had been at the Nui Dat base 5 kilometers from the fighting throughout the battle, received the Distinguished Service Order. His citation stated that he had personally directed the engagement and that his personal direction had been a decisive factor in the outcome. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend, who had arrived at the plantation after the main fighting was already over, received the Distinguished Service Order. His citation stated that he had taken firm and effective control of the battle. Harry Smith spent the next 30 years accumulating documentation, conducting interviews, writing submissions, and stating as precisely as he could manage that these citations contained claims that were not true. He described them, in his careful and deliberate phrasing, as tantamount to perjury. The man the citation praised had not left the base. The man who had actually been decisive had been recommended for a Distinguished Service Order and received a military cross. Captain Maury Stanley received no gallantry award. The man who had stood at Smith's shoulder through the entire engagement, calling fire from 24 guns on a map that the rain was dissolving, bringing those shells to within 30 meters of the men he was protecting, overcoming what he himself called his dread of making a mistake, received a Member of the Order of the British Empire, an administrative honor with no connection to battlefield gallantry. The mechanism by which this happened was explained years later by Dave Sabin with the cold logic of someone who had watched the system work. It was considered inappropriate for the forward observer to receive an award equivalent to the company commander, whose own Distinguished Service Order recommendation had already been downgraded to a military cross. The consequence of cutting Smith's award was that Stanley's award had to be cut to match. The circularity was complete. The hierarchy of recognition had been preserved. The hierarchy of actual contribution and actual risk bore no resemblance to it. Maury Stanley died of cancer in September of 2010. He never received a gallantry medal for what he did at Long Tan. Harry Smith began the formal campaign for review in 1996, 30 years after the battle, working with the other surviving commanders who had been present on August the 18th. He lobbied prime ministers. He testified before parliamentary committees. He wrote hundreds of letters and formal submissions and engaged journalists and military historians to help build the documented case. He was relentless in the way that a man is relentless when the injustice is personal, and the men it concerns have been waiting long enough. On the 17th of August, 2006, he secured a private meeting with Prime Minister John Howard at Parliament House in Canberra, the day before the 40th anniversary of the battle. Howard listened to what Smith had to say. He examined what Smith brought. He was moved by both. One of the final acts of his government before losing the federal election in 2007 was to commission an independent review panel to examine the Long Tan Awards. In 2008, 42 years after the battle, the government accepted the review panel's recommendations. Smith's Military Cross was upgraded to the Star of Gallantry, the contemporary Australian equivalent of the Distinguished Service Order that had originally been recommended for him. Sabin and Kendall received medals for gallantry, the equivalent of the Military Cross they had been recommended for in 1966. In 2016, following a further application by Smith to a Defense Honors and Awards Appeals Tribunal, Gordon Sharp received a posthumous commendation for gallantry, 50 years after he died performing the act it recognized. Lieutenant Adrian Roberts received a medal for gallantry. Several other soldiers from Delta Company received awards or upgrades long overdue. The tribunal examined Jack Kirby's case and concluded that the Distinguished Conduct Medal he had received in 1966 was the appropriate award for his actions. Smith and the veterans who had served beside Kirby have never accepted that conclusion. Not a single Victoria Cross was awarded to any member of the 1st Australian Task Force for any action in the Vietnam War. Harry Smith died on August the 20th, 2023. He was 90 years old. He had lived long enough to see his own award restored to what it should have been, and to see some of his men receive, decades late, recognition that should have been given while they were young. He died 2 days after the 57th anniversary of the battle, as if he had been waiting for the 18th to pass before he allowed himself to stop. He had spent more years fighting the bureaucratic aftermath of Long Tan than the battle itself had lasted by a factor that is almost impossible to calculate. The country these men came home to was not ready for them and would not be for years. Vietnam veterans returned to an Australia that was divided on the war, exhausted by the political arguments surrounding it, and not particularly interested in expressing gratitude to the men who had fought in it. They were called mercenaries by some. Some were spat on. The RSL clubs that had always been the institutional home of the returned soldier were reluctant to accept Vietnam veterans because the war was too controversial, too politically charged, too different from the wars those institutions had been built around. For more than a decade after the last Australian soldiers came home, Long Tan was known mainly to the men who had been there and the families of the men who had not come back. The battle that had demonstrated the most extraordinary small unit courage and tactical effectiveness in Australia's post-war military history was not celebrated. It was filed away. Truth has a way of resurfacing, even when the institutions responsible for preserving it prefer it buried. On the 18th of August, 1969, 3 years after the battle, soldiers of 6 RAR still serving in Vietnam flew by helicopter to the Long Tan plantation and erected a cross on the site of 11 platoons' last stand, on the ground where Gordon Sharp had fallen and where 13 men had died in the course of one terrible hour. The cross was rough and functional, reinforced concrete made by military hands from military materials set into the red dirt of the plantation at the spot that mattered most. When the Australians completed their withdrawal from Vietnam in 1971, the cross was left behind. It was eventually displaced by Vietnamese authorities and recovered by a museum in Bien Hoa. A replica now stands in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Annual commemorations are held at the original site every 18th of August. In 1987, Prime Minister Bob Hawke, in the aftermath of the Welcome Home Parade that finally gave Vietnam veterans a public acknowledgement they had been waiting for since 1971, proclaimed the 18th of August Vietnam Veterans Day. It commemorates not only Long Tan, but all 60,000 Australians who served in Vietnam and the 520 who died there. The battle has worked its way into Australian culture gradually and with the incompleteness that attaches to stories that should have been told earlier. A documentary narrated by Sam Worthington, broadcast in 2006. A feature film, Danger Close, The Battle of Long Tan, directed by Creve Stenders and starring Travis Fimmel as Smith, released in 2019 to audiences many of whom had never heard the name Long Tan. Books by Smith, Buick, Sabin, Grandin, and others setting down the record before time removes the people who hold it. The argument about Jack Kirby's Victoria Cross continues. The argument about the precise enemy casualty figures continues. The question of whether it was a prepared ambush or an encounter battle continues. The Vietnamese have their own account, and their commanders who have spoken since the war confirm their intention and claim political victory. The women of the Vo Thi Sao Company who moved through the plantation that night, choosing not to harm the wounded Australians they found in the dark, have no monument. They were there. What 108 men did on the afternoon of August the 18th, 1966, was not supposed to be possible by any standard military calculation. 108 against 2,500. No air support because of weather that grounded everything with wings. Ammunition almost exhausted before the main assault had even begun. Platoon commanders killed or cut off. The killing ground partially disrupted but not neutralized. Every factor that a military planner would point to as decisive was pointing toward the destruction of Delta Company. The outcome was the breaking of an enemy regiment's offensive capability, the protection of the base, and the establishment of conditions that would allow Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy Province to continue effectively for the next 5 years. They achieved it because artillery directed by a New Zealander working from dissolving paper in a monsoon was accurate enough to hold a perimeter that rifles alone could not have held. They achieved it because a sergeant took fire over his own head and survived it and kept 8 men alive who should not have been alive. They achieved it because a company sergeant major walked through open ground alone and silenced a machine gun that would otherwise have killed everyone it could reach. They achieved it because a major had spent a year building a company that knew how to function when everything was going wrong, and because that company, when everything was going wrong, functioned. The men who marched out of Nui Dat on the morning of August the 18th heard a concert playing behind them as they moved east into the plantation. The same helicopters that had flown the entertainers in that morning flew the ammunition that kept them alive that evening. Gordon Sharp, 21 years old, rose to his knees in the rain to direct fire that would save the men around him, died in the act, and was found the next morning still facing the enemy with his rifle in his hands. He received no recognition for 50 years. The system that was supposed to honor what he did gave his recognition to men who were 5 kilometers away and never saw what he saw. They were mostly 21 years old, these men. They had not chosen this war. Many of them had not chosen the army. They had chosen, in the hours that mattered, to do what the situation required with everything they had. 18 of them died doing it. The rest carried Long Tan for the remainder of their lives, some of those lives cut short by the war and its aftermath, some stretching long enough to see partial justice arrived at in small increments over 5 decades, none of them ever fully free of what happened in that plantation on a wet August afternoon in 1966. Harry Smith carried it for 57 years and 2 days and then put it down. Now you know. The men in the offices tried to bury this story twice, once with false citations that gave credit to people who were not there, and once with the silence that surrounds a war a country would rather forget. If you believe these men deserved better than that, share what you have just heard. The only monument that lasts is the one built from memory, and memory survives only when people who know the truth refuse to let it go.